Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to have you here today. We're about to dive into a topic that's essential for developing secure and efficient applications, mastering Microsoft Graph API permissions and consent models. On this first slide, you'll see the main title, and just below, the subtitle highlights what we'll be exploring: navigating permission types, understanding consent experiences, and adopting security best practices. Over the course of this presentation, we'll cover how to manage permissions effectively, streamline the consent process, and ensure your app deployment is both seamless and secure. So let's get started. Welcome to today's discussion on Graph API permissions and consent models. Many developers find that Microsoft Graph permissions can be confusing, especially when their apps work perfectly in development but run into issues in production. Understanding the different consent models behind these permissions is key to avoiding unexpected prompts for admin consent or permission denials. This knowledge helps us ensure a smooth rollout of our apps and encourages user adoption by aligning what our apps need with our organization's security policies. By the end of this session, you'll have a clearer picture of how permissions and consent work together so you can deploy your apps confidently and efficiently. Let's take a closer look at the gap between the development and production environments. In the production environment, we have strict controls in place to protect organizational data. Permissions typically require admin approval, and default policies are set to restrict what apps can do. This ensures that only authorized actions are allowed, safeguarding sensitive information. On the other hand, in the development environment, the settings are much more permissive. This allows developers to test and experiment with features quickly without constantly requesting permissions. For example, broad access is granted to test new functionalities efficiently. Understanding these differences is crucial when mastering Microsoft Graph API permissions and consent models. It highlights why managing these permissions carefully is vital for maintaining security in production, while also enabling rapid development and testing during the development phase. Recognizing this gap helps us build better strategies for moving code from development into production smoothly and securely. Let's talk about some common permission errors you might encounter in a production environment. These errors can really block functionality when real users start interacting with your app. It's a crucial point because what works smoothly in development can suddenly hit a wall in production. Many developers get confused because they see no issues during testing. But once the app is live, cryptic messages pop up and features get blocked. This confusion often stems from the fact that production tenants have stricter rules around user consent, especially for sensitive permissions. In production, tenants typically restrict user consent for certain permissions, which means you'll need an administrator to review and approve those permissions. This is a key part of maintaining security and control over what your app can access. Some of the most common errors you'll see include messages like "need admin approval" or error codes such as AADSDS 65001. These signals are basically permission denials, indicating that your app is trying to access something it hasn't been granted permission for yet. Understanding these errors and the underlying consent models helps you troubleshoot effectively and ensures your app functions smoothly once it's in production. Now, let's take a closer look at the different permission models in Microsoft Graph. First, we have application permissions, which allow apps to act independently without a user context. Essentially, these permissions give the app broader access across the tenant, but they also come with stricter security controls and require admin consent before they can be used. This means that when an app uses application permissions, it operates with its own identity, not tied to any individual user. On the other hand, we have delegated permissions. These are used when the app operates under a signed-in user's identity. In this case, the app can only perform actions that the user is authorized to do. This setup limits the app's access to what that specific user can access, providing a more controlled and secure way to interact with Microsoft Graph. Understanding the distinction between application and delegated permissions is crucial because it impacts how you design your app's access and security model. It's all about balancing the need for broader access with the necessary security and compliance requirements. Delegated permissions let an app act on behalf of a signed-in user, inheriting their access rights. This means the app can only access data that the user is authorized to see or modify, ensuring a level of security and control. Typically, consent is granted by the user during sign-in, which makes this model ideal for interactive scenarios. Because the user is involved in granting access, this approach helps limit risk and simplifies the consent process. Overall, delegated permissions are a key part of how we manage secure, user-driven interactions with Microsoft Graph API. Now, let's dive into application permissions explained. First, let's talk about the usage context. These permissions are mainly used for tasks that don't require user interaction, which means they can run smoothly in the background without bothering the user. This makes them ideal for automation and background processes. Next, security implications are really important to consider. Because application permissions grant broad access, they carry a higher risk. That's why any use of these permissions needs to have admin consent up front and undergo thorough security reviews before we deploy them. We want to make sure our organization stays protected. Moving on to the scope of access, these permissions give the application extensive capabilities across the organization. For example, with the right permissions, an app could read all calendars or access mailboxes across the organization, so it's quite powerful. Finally, let's clarify what application permissions are. They enable an app to operate independently without a signed-in user. Think of them as background tools that perform tasks autonomously or facilitate integrations that need broad access without direct user involvement. Understanding these points helps us see how crucial responsible management of application permissions is to keep our environment secure while leveraging the full potential of Microsoft Graph. Let's talk about why choosing between delegated and application permissions really matters. Matching the permission model to your app's specific use case helps you avoid unnecessary friction during development and deployment. It also plays a crucial role in addressing security concerns effectively. When we optimize permission models, it's important to understand that application permissions usually require admin approval because they have a broader scope. This can cause some delays, but it also ensures a higher level of security for your organization. Now, the choice between delegated and application permissions also impacts the user's consent experience. Delegated permissions allow users to self-consent for their data, which often results in smoother and faster rollouts. So, understanding these differences helps you select the right approach for your app, balancing security with user experience, all while aligning with your overall goals for a seamless and secure integration. Let's take a look at some real-world examples of calendar access apps and how they handle permissions and consent models. First, there's the approach that requires admin consent and security reviews. This method gives the app access to all calendars organization-wide, which can be powerful, but also adds complexity to deployment. It's important to remember that this approach often involves a higher level of oversight and security scrutiny. On the other hand, we have apps that allow seamless user consent, but their access is limited to the signed-in user's calendar. This makes deployment much simpler, as it doesn't require admin approval and aligns well with user privacy expectations. Now, when we compare application permissions for organization-wide access versus delegated permissions for individual user access, the key difference is scope and complexity. Application permissions are suited for broader access across the organization, but they come with more setup and security considerations. Delegated permissions, however, are more straightforward and focus on individual user data, making them easier to implement and manage. Understanding these models is crucial for choosing the right approach based on your app's needs and your organization's security policies. It ties back to our overall theme of balancing functionality with security and user experience. Let's take a closer look at Slide 10, which focuses on consent confusion between user and admin approval. When we talk about permissions extending to organization-wide data, it's important to remember that these require admin approval. This step is crucial because it helps ensure security compliance and prevents any unauthorized exposure of sensitive information. On the other hand, there are permissions that users can grant themselves, but these are typically limited to their own data. This type of consent is known as user consentable, and it generally involves lower risk since users are only granting access to their own information. Now, it's helpful to differentiate between admin-required permissions and user-granted permissions. Admin permissions tend to cover broader organizational data, and they need higher levels of approval to maintain security. User-granted permissions are more about individual consent and control, which makes them less risky, but still important to manage carefully. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding these permission and consent models is key to mastering how we manage secure, compliant access with Microsoft Graph API. It's all about knowing when and how to seek approval, depending on the scope of data involved. Now, let's take a closer look at permission scope and risk levels. When working with Microsoft Graph API, it's crucial to understand the difference between permissions and how they impact security and user trust. For example, reading all users' calendars is an admin-only permission, meaning only administrators can grant this access. This is a high-risk permission because it involves sensitive data and requires careful oversight. On the other hand, reading a single user's calendar is user-consentable, which means the individual user can grant or deny this permission themselves. This is generally considered lower risk because it limits access to just one person's data, and users have more control. The key takeaway here is that permissions vary in risk, and it's important to choose the least privilege necessary for your application to function effectively. This aligns with our overall theme of mastering permissions and consent models to ensure secure, responsible access to data. Now, let's take a look at the impact of tenant policies and security defaults. As we master the Microsoft Graph API permissions and consent models, it's important to recognize that organizational configurations might require additional approvals. This means that the default consent process becomes a bit more complex because there are extra layers of control to consider. Conditional access and compliance settings are key here. They add these layers of control to ensure that organizational policies are enforced. These settings can override default consent behaviors, providing organizations with the ability to enforce specific security requirements. It's also crucial to understand that tenant-level policies and security defaults often restrict users from granting new permissions without an admin review. Even permissions that seem low risk can be subject to scrutiny under these policies. So, while the permissions landscape might seem straightforward at first glance, these additional controls help protect the organization from potential security gaps. Overall, these configurations highlight the importance of understanding both user permissions and organizational policies when managing access and security in your tenant environment. Let's take a look at some of the challenges faced by citizen developers and power users. One of the main issues is mastering Microsoft Graph API permissions and understanding the consent models. This is crucial because it directly impacts how smoothly their applications can be developed and deployed. What this slide emphasizes is the importance of early coordination with IT teams. By engaging it early on, citizen developers can better understand the consent policies in place, which helps avoid surprises down the line. Clear communication about these policies ensures everyone is on the same page. Now, a common frustration for these developers is hitting permission walls. They often encounter delays when their apps require permissions that haven't been granted yet. This can slow down development and lead to frustration, especially if they're eager to move forward. Finally, we need to address admin consent barriers. Non-admin developers or power users might create apps that work perfectly in a permissive development environment, but once they try to move into production, they face admin consent restrictions. These barriers are put in place to protect the organization, but they can be a hurdle if not managed properly. Overall, understanding these permission and consent challenges and working proactively with it can make a big difference in enabling citizen developers to innovate effectively without unnecessary delays. Let's take a closer look at high-risk permissions and their consequences. As we see here, mastering Microsoft Graph API permissions and consent models is crucial because these risks justify the strict controls we place on high-risk permissions. When we talk about justification for these controls, it's because if these permissions are compromised, the apps using them can pose serious threats, including data leaks and unauthorized access to sensitive information. That's why we enforce strict security reviews and require admin consent for these permissions. Permissions like directory, read, all or mail, read-write, all grant extensive access to organizational data, making them particularly powerful but also potentially dangerous if misused. These broad permissions significantly expand the scope of what an app can access, which is why they trigger rigorous security measures to protect our data and systems. Let's talk about planning permissions carefully from the start. This is a crucial step in mastering Microsoft Graph API permissions and consent models. First, it's essential to plan your permissions carefully early on. By doing this, you can prevent potential rollout issues down the line, which could otherwise lead to costly rework or delays. Another key point is to collaborate with tenant admins right from the beginning. Working closely with them helps to reduce security concerns and builds a shared understanding of what permissions are needed. It's all about establishing the required permissions early, so you ensure smoother consent flows and avoid surprises during deployment. Defining your permissions before you start coding is also vital. This alignment helps your app's permissions match your actual needs, preventing headaches when it's time to deploy. And of course, early scoping of permissions allows you to identify and address any gaps or issues up front. Overall, by thinking through these permission considerations early, you set the stage for a more streamlined, secure, and efficient implementation process. It's about proactive planning to keep your project on track and secure from the start. Let's talk about the principle of least privilege as a best practice. The idea here is that precise permissions help make consent processes much smoother and also enhance security compliance. When we grant only the permissions that are absolutely necessary, we reduce the chance of over-permissioning, which can lead to unnecessary risks. Avoiding the habit of giving, just in case, permissions is key. Instead, we focus on scoped, precise access that aligns exactly with what our app needs. This not only minimizes security risks, but also makes it easier for administrators to approve permissions and simplifies the overall approval process. Additionally, when permissions are tightly scoped, it builds greater trust with users because they see that their data is protected and that the app isn't asking for more access than it needs. Adopting this principle means we should always request only the minimal permissions required for our app to function properly. This keeps our environment safer, reduces administrative overhead, and improves user confidence. Now, let's talk about the importance of regular reviews when it comes to managing permissions and consent models in Microsoft Graph API. Regular reviews help us identify and remove permissions that are no longer necessary, which is crucial for keeping our environment secure. By doing this, we also make consent management much more straightforward and less risky. However, many organizations face challenges in maintaining this discipline consistently. Limited resources, competing priorities, and the complexity of permissions can make it difficult to stay on top of these reviews. Microsoft recommends conducting these reviews quarterly. This frequency strikes a good balance, ensuring that permissions are kept up to date, compliance is maintained, and risks are minimized. The key takeaway here is that periodic permission reviews are a best practice. They're essential for managing security, ensuring ongoing compliance, and reducing potential vulnerabilities. This approach fits into our overall goal of maintaining a robust and secure environment, especially as permissions and app usage evolve over time. When we request broad permissions, it can really increase the administrative overhead. This means more time and effort are needed to manage and review those permissions, which can slow down our overall processes. As a result, deploying applications takes longer, and this can be frustrating for users who are eager to see new features or updates. Additionally, these broad permission requests often trigger lengthy security reviews by the security committees. They want to be sure that granting such wide access doesn't pose unnecessary risks. Sometimes, these requests even get caught in automated blocks, which can prevent the app from functioning properly until the permissions are adjusted or approved. Finally, requesting overly broad permissions can set off tenant-wide risk alerts. These are alerts that signal potential security concerns across the entire organization, which can lead to further scrutiny or restrictions. So, in summary, while broad permissions might seem convenient initially, they often lead to delays, increased security hurdles, and even operational risks, all of which we want to avoid by being precise and intentional with our permission requests. Let's talk about strategies for building smooth consent experiences. One of the most effective approaches is engaging early in the process. When we involve users or stakeholders early on, we can turn them into champions who support the approval process. This proactive engagement helps reduce surprises later and makes the overall adoption smoother, with less resistance. Next, it's crucial to provide clear explanations on the consent screens. We want users to understand exactly what they're consenting to, so clarity here is key. Transparent communication about the purpose of permissions builds trust and minimizes confusion. Speaking of transparency, always communicate permission purposes openly. Let users know why each permission is needed and how it will be used. This openness reassures users and fosters confidence in the process. Finally, to ease the consent process, consider piloting your apps with trusted users or your IT staff first. This step allows you to gather feedback, address concerns, and make improvements before wider deployment. Overall, these strategies, early engagement, clear explanations, transparent communication, and pilot testing, are all about making the consent experience straightforward, trustworthy, and less intimidating for users. Now, let's talk about how this approach simplifies consent, lowers perceived risk, and builds user confidence. When we avoid overwhelming permission prompts, users are more comfortable granting access, which leads to better engagement. One key strategy is to use fine-grained scopes. This means we limit access to exactly what's necessary, nothing more. By doing this, we respect user privacy and make permissions clearer. Another important point is requesting permissions incrementally, what we call granular permission requests. Instead of asking for everything up front, we request access as needed based on what the user is doing. This incremental approach not only feels less intrusive, but also gives users more control and confidence in the process. Overall, these methods make permission handling smoother, more transparent, and ultimately more trustworthy for users. Now, let's talk about how to minimize disruption and ensure compliance throughout the entire app lifecycle. It's crucial to design your apps in a way that permissions are escalated gradually, matching the development and feature rollout process. This approach helps prevent sudden changes that could impact users or violate policies. Another key point is securing pre-approvals for the permissions your app will need before you even finish development. By doing this early, you avoid delays and make sure everything is aligned with organizational policies. And speaking of planning, incorporating admin consent workflows early in your project is essential. Engaging administrators from the start ensures smooth approval processes and helps maintain compliance from the outset. All these strategies, gradual permission escalation, securing pre-approvals, and early admin involvement, are about managing risk and maintaining trust throughout your app's lifecycle, which ties back to our overall goal of responsible and compliant app development. In this real case study, we're looking at how refining Power Platform permissions can make a significant difference. The key takeaway here is that when end users clearly understand what data the app is accessing, it eliminates surprises and reduces friction during adoption. This example really highlights the power of using minimal, well-scoped permissions. By doing so, we make the consent process smoother and help speed up the overall deployment. In this particular case, the team was able to secure admin approval in less than a week, thanks to this lean approach. It shows how focusing on only the necessary permissions can accelerate approval processes and get apps into production faster. The team started by carefully trimming down the permission list to only the scopes that were actually needed. They also provided detailed justifications for each permission, which helped build trust and clarity around their app's access requirements. Looking at the initial challenge, a finance team created a Power Platform app to pull SharePoint data for quarterly reports. At first, they requested broad site permissions, which triggered delays in admin approval and blocked the rollout. This example underscores how broad permissions can slow down deployment and create unnecessary hurdles. By refining permissions and being transparent about what each scope is for, teams can streamline approvals and make the whole process more efficient. Let's talk about how we can leverage Azure AD consent tools to maintain control. One effective approach is using pre-approval workflows to vet permissions early in the development process. By doing this, we identify and address potential issues before coding even begins, which helps streamline the entire process. It's also helpful to share sample consent screens and clear rationales with stakeholders up front, so everyone understands what permissions are needed and why. Another key point is conducting periodic permission reviews, such as quarterly assessments. These reviews ensure that our applications continue to follow the principle of least privilege, reducing unnecessary access and helping us stay compliant with changing policies. When it comes to high-risk or broad-scope permissions, admin approval should be reserved for those cases. This adds an extra layer of control over sensitive data and helps prevent accidental overreach. For lower-risk permissions, Azure AD offers the ability to delegate consent to managers or app owners. This delegation reduces administrative bottlenecks and makes the process more efficient, especially for permissions that pose less risk. Overall, these tools and strategies give us a solid framework to balance security with agility, aligning perfectly with our goal of maintaining control without hampering productivity. Now, as we wrap up, I want to emphasize the importance of thoughtful permission planning and transparent consent strategies. These practices are crucial for building trust with both users and IT teams. When you approach permission management openly, it not only reduces support tickets, but also keeps your rollout on track. Essentially, it turns potential blockers into enablers of your digital transformation journey. Using Azure AD's consent management features allows you to delegate, review, and control permissions dynamically, giving you flexibility and oversight. It's important to plan your consent flows early, collaborate with tenant admins and security teams up front. This helps align everyone's expectations and makes approval processes smoother. Remember the principle of least privilege: only request the permissions your app genuinely needs. This minimizes unnecessary access and increases trust. Also, carefully match permission types, whether delegated or application, to your app's actual usage to avoid surprises, like unexpected admin consent roadblocks. In conclusion, building trust through transparency and properly managing permissions and consent are key to avoiding pitfalls. When done correctly, they turn permission management into a strategic advantage that supports your overall digital transformation efforts.